There's a lesson in there, just a little more than would be a month ago. 100 years before that marked the end of the First World War. This particular incident took place on Christmas of 1914, 4 years before the end of the war, when these guys caught something of the spirit of Christmas and what should happen between human beings. And that little film was made to reflect on and commemorate these guys meeting there in no man's land on the battlefields in Belgium. The following day, the guns fired up again. And by the end of 1918, 16 million people had lost their lives. Mostly young men in the prime of their youth, German, Belgium, French, British lads, 16 million. The great bulk of those deaths occurred after this event on Christmas Eve of 1914. Up to that point, there had been about 700,000 deaths. This is not including wounded and injured. And you wonder, well, if they met in that middle ground and if they shook hands, if they played football together, if they had that peace, how come that following that, another 15 million lives would be lost? It all comes down to our lack of understanding of what peace truly is. You see, for most of us, we think that peace is the absence of conflict. We think that peace is agreeing not to fight. But you see, they agreed not to fight, and there was absence of conflict on New Year's Eve, on Christmas Eve of 1914 and Christmas Day, and yet it all kicked off again straight after Christmas, much like it will be with some of you. Much like what's going to happen in your family if you make it through Christmas Day. Do you know what the number one prayer request when people start to reflect on Christmas and the whole thing touches them and some kind of spirituality emerges? And we've proved this in last year, particularly in what was the Micklegate Mingle, where the shops and the churches in Micklegate had a Christmas celebration, and we had a prayer request board, and the most prominent prayer on there, and this is the most prominent prayer in all churches and all requests throughout the whole of the country at Christmas, is, please will you pray that my family will get along. Please will you pray that we won't finish up fighting. That's the number one prayer. And there's a lesson in there because we can go from this just agreeing not to fight to killing each other in so many ways, in so many aspects of our life, so quickly, for one simple reason, that we have not understood the essence of what peace really is. Agreeing not to fight is not peace. In fact, we use a phrase often that says, we agree to disagree. That never brings peace either. Because agreeing not to fight is not what peace is. Peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is the presence of something, not the absence of something. Here's how a guy called Luke wrote it up in the Bible almost 2,000 years ago. You can find it in Luke chapter 2 and verse 14. When he tries to describe the issue of the visitation, the angels, he said, and they said, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace and goodwill towards men. You see, peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is the presence of goodwill. And if all you've got on your heart for yourself, for your family, for the world this Christmas is somehow, well, it's Christmas time, we agree not to fight, we'll get rid of the conflict, you will not know what true peace is that lasts and changes the world. If only instead of there being, on December the 24th, 1914, instead of there being just an agreement not to fight and to stop the conflict, if only there had been a feeling of goodwill, that we show goodwill, maybe 15 million more people wouldn't have died. And there'd have been 15 million more lives that were changed, and 15 million more families, 15 million more stories, if we just understood that peace is not the absence of conflict, but peace is the presence of goodwill. I believe if there's an essence to the Christmas story that's powerful for all of us, it's peace and goodwill to all men. That the message of Christmas is not that there will never be problems, there will never be issues, there will never be falling out, but the issue of Christmas is that in the middle of this thing that we call life, if we will take hold of this gift of peace and goodwill to all men, then something will change. I believe that's what the story of the manger is about, peace and goodwill to all men. But if Christmas is going to be anything, it's your receiving of that and saying, in the light of that and because of that, I'm going to show goodwill to all men, not just on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, but in all of my life to all people, blessing, helping, and serving. You see, goodwill is the will for good. Goodwill's not something you buy at Debenhams or you get from Amazon on the internet that comes by Prime the following morning. You can't order it online. You can't buy it in a store. It has to come from the will. It's the will for good. And how many of you realize if there was deep within us a willingness to leave our pettinesses, our warrings, the things that turn from a little disruption between us and others into a war where we want to kill and maim and damage, if we would take our will and decide that we are going to show goodness, then that's when war ends. That's when the fighting stops. That's when we begin to be at peace. And that's when this thing called glory, presence, essence, light, life begins to surround us. So the message to you tonight is simple. Peace does not come from agreeing not to fight. Peace does not come from the absence of conflict. Peace comes in the presence of goodwill. Let in your heart tonight it be peace and goodwill to all men.